Jeff Russo, season 3 of Fargo is about to start up on FX. I remember the first time that we talked about it during the first season. You said you were competing with Carter Burwell's score for the film. When we talked again in season 2, you said you were competing against your own work in season 1. So now that you're in season 3, are you competing against anybody anymore?
I think that I think that as you continue anything, you're always competing with yourself. So, I think that I'm going back and listening to music in season 1. I'm going back and listening to music in season 2. I'm trying to beat some of the things for certain feelings. I'm trying to retain some of that feeling, and then also trying to create a new narrative, musical narrative. And so, yeah, I think I'm constantly competing with myself. I think that after the first season, we sort of stopped competing really with the original, because, as much as we weren't really competing with the original. We were sort of walking in its shadow, so to speak. And I think now we're not really doing that. Now we're sort of walking in our own shadow. And so in that respect, I think, always competing with yourself,
Well, you have gotten 2 Emmy nominations as a result of your work on Fargo. What has that kind of recognition meant for you?
It's interesting. It was very surprising. The first time was very surprising. The second time was just as surprising. I think that it's an awesome feeling to know that, or to think that people who are my peers are thinking of this work as something worthy of this kind of recognition. All the other nominees both those years were so great. The scores were so great. Just to sort of be thought of as being in that same group is it's thrilling. It's really, really thrilling.
Well, congratulations again. So season 3, as is the case with all seasons of Fargo, there's a different story, different cast, different time periods. This time we're back in 2010.
Yep.
I believe. So what were some of the changes that you made to the score?
Well, I think that the general idea of how we use score hasn't changed. We try to be very judicious with the amount of score that we use. We try to only play music and play those emotional moments when we've earned it emotionally, whether it's tension or big drama or an emotional beat. I think that we've always sort of had this operating philosophy of don't ever play music until we've earned the right to play the music. So none of that has changed. Thematically speaking, there is a Russian element in the characters of this season. So I've sort of entered into trying to have a little bit more of a Russian flavor. There's always been somewhat of an Eastern European flavor to the type of score that I've written for all 3 seasons. This one moves a little bit farther to the east into the Russian sort of classical realm. But other than that, I think that, the idea of how we tell story hasn't really changed. It's just a question of, as the story changes, I have to adapt different themes and different ways of dealing with characters. But I think that in general, the storytelling device of music is very similar in usage.
Now, switching gears a little bit, you also worked on Legion this year, again with Noah Hawley. I want to ask, how did you get involved with that?
Well, in the same way that I got involved with Fargo, Noah and I have a collaboration that has spanned a number of different shows. And after we were finishing up Fargo 2, he called me up and he said, what do you think of doing an X-Men show? And I was like, well, I was a huge X-Men fan when I was a kid. And so I was like, that sounds really great. What, how, where, when, why? Like, I had all these questions. And he said, let's go have dinner. And we went and sat down and talked about it. And we connected on this idea of the sound of Dark Side of the Moon was sort of the 70s sound of schizophrenia. And how does that sort of play into how we would make music for this particular show? And so that was sort of a touchstone for our being able to talk about what the score was going to be. But that sort of began the idea of how we were going to collaborate on that particular show. So yeah, I mean, it was really one of those, like, he called me up and said, hey, do you want to do this? And I said, yeah, let's definitely do that. So.
Well, what's fascinating about it is that it's not your typical superhero show. You know, it's not what you would expect, in much the same way that Fargo was not what we would have expected it to be.
Right.
Legion is not what we would have expected it to be. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you know, it's funny. I think that everything that Noah does or writes is sort of left of expectation. You know, he has such a unique style of telling a story that it's no surprise to me that every time we get together to do something, it's definitely not expected. You know, with Legion, the idea was if the character didn't know what was real and what wasn't real, why wouldn't it be also then okay for the audience to not know what was real and what was hallucination or you know, non-reality? So how was I going to express that in music, you know? And I went back and forth between a very electronic feel to a very orchestral feel. And, you know, there's this love story of the ages in the show between David and Sid, and that was, to me, the grounding mechanism of the score. You know, being able to, I started by writing this first piece of music that was for David, which was very sort of schizophrenic in nature. It had a very weird off-kilter electronic element and a very sort of weird then off-kilter orchestral version of that same theme played. And then I wrote this theme for David and Sid, which had a much more sort of languid and lush feeling to it. And to me, that was sort of the touchstone of the whole score, which was how to really tell the story of this person who doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's not, and also the love that this person has for this other person and vice versa. And I think maybe I got lost in telling the story of that part of the score. But that's really how that whole thing started to formulate in and of itself.
And the show is certainly, for lack of a better term, very trippy. I wonder if you could talk a bit about, there's sort of a quality to the music that it puts you right inside the head of this character who is sort of all over the place. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was the original idea, was how to place the music in David's head, because really the entire show is about his perception, and is what he's seeing real, is what he's seeing not real, are his powers real, is this experience he's having at Clockworks real, is his experience of love with Sid real. So really the whole score was meant to bring you into his mind. And that's why some of the score is actually very schizophrenic. Like I've sort of go all over the map from a very, you know, lush piece of music that evokes memory and nostalgia to a very atonal orchestral sort of the quartet playing all wrong notes and a lot of these orchestral effects. And then the idea of playing these big horn stabs when you see this monster that's in his head, and spoiler alert, it's the Shadow King. And when you see that person, how jarring, or that thing, how jarring those sounds were, you know, all of it was meant to sound like and bring you into his head. So really it just was all about how to create the sound of what he might hear in his head during a hallucination or in reality. As a matter of fact, Noah asked me to read Oliver Sacks's book called Hallucinations. There's a whole part of the book on auditory hallucinations. And that was really informative to me in terms of, you know, what people hear when they're having a hallucination, or how people actually have auditory hallucinations and what that sounds like.
Wow, really? Switching gears again, you also worked on this past Emmy season, The Night Of, which is totally different from Fargo and Legion. Talk a little bit about how you got involved with that.
Well, so Steve Zalian, who's the writer, producer, showrunner, director, sort of artist who made the show along with Richard Price, had had heard a bunch of my score from Fargo seasons 1 and 2, really liked what I had done, and reached out and said, hey, can we have a meeting? And it was one of those things where it was like, well, yeah, of course. I mean, he'd written some of my favorite movies that I'd ever seen, Schindler's List and Moneyball and some of these really, really huge movies. But what really drew me to his work was, as a director, he directed this movie called Searching for Bobby Fischer, which was this movie that I had seen back in 1993, I think, and I loved so much and was so drawn to that type of storytelling. So when someone called me and said, would you, are you interested in this thing? I was like, oh my God, of course, this guy is fantastic. So we had this meeting, and we really sort of hit it off in terms of what we thought the score for that show should be, which is very subtle. It's, we use music in a very subtle way, but it's very effective because the show is told in a very subtle but very powerful way. So he basically handed me all 8 episodes and said, go watch all of them and then call me. So I watched all of them and I was blown away. I called him and I said, I think I know exactly what needs to be done. And he said, great, call me in 6 weeks. So I did that, and I basically wrote, the very first thing I wrote was the theme, and I sent it to him, and he was like, this is perfect, you're on the right track. So then I continued to write the rest of the score for the show over the course of the next 6 weeks or so. And then after that, then we had this back and forth of how to make it, like, how to tailor it really for him and how he wanted it to be exactly here and exactly there. He was really really involved and collaborative. It was really a great experience.
Well, like with your other work, The Night Of really plays with expectations. It's not your typical courtroom drama or police procedural. Can you talk a little bit about how that affected your music?
Well, yeah, I'm sort of a child of watching Law and Order, right? And this is sort of it's the opposite of Law and Order, and yet it has the same. It has some of the same feelings that evokes. It's sort of a very real look at things. I mean, especially the early seasons of Law and Order. But this takes it from a whole different perspective, which is these. It was a very real look at what happens when someone is arrested and then put through the criminal justice system. And yet we didn't push on the emotion of the story at all. Like we let the emotional content really play itself, and that made it a very heavy emotional moment, the whole story. And because of that, we were able to use music in a way that was very pointed and very sort of surgical, because we didn't just play music whenever there was a moment of fear, or a moment of sadness, or a moment of true emotion. We let those emotions play a lot dry, and because these performances were so riveting, it made my job really easy. Like, John Turturro is such a spectacular actor. I never had to do anything to help him. I never had to do anything to help Riz. Riz Ahmed is such a fantastic actor as well. All of the performances are spectacular. So it just made my job so much easier.
Speaking of Riz Ahmed and John Turturro, the other point I was going to bring up is that the show is interesting structurally in that it follows these two protagonists. Riz Ahmed is the person who's wrongly accused of murder, spoiler alert, and John Turturro as the down on his luck lawyer who takes on the case. How did following those two distinct narratives affect your work?
Well, I treated them very differently. Riz I treated very straight. Nas was his character's name. And I treated that character sort of very straight, very bare bones, like this is what's happening. And I can play tension here. I can play his fear here. With John's character, it was a lot more nuanced because he sort of walked this line between being very serious, and yet there was something very ironic about the character and how he sort of managed through the world. So I had to be able to treat that with a lot more nuance. So I had to go about treating these two protagonists, and by the way, also both antagonists. So they both sort of acted as both of those things for each other. On the one hand, John was the protagonist and the antagonist for Nas, and vice versa. So it was really sort of jumping back and forth between those two things that really made for the score being what it is, you know.
Right. With all three of these projects, they're very distinct stylistically and tonally, and then your music is very distinct. And we've only scratched the surface of all that you've been up to this year. But can you talk about going from project to project and giving it what it needs musically?
It's interesting. I mean, every project needs something different, you know, but I think, a way that I go about trying to help tell a story that is sort of uniform to what I do. You know, each one of those projects are very different from the other, but I think that the way to go about telling a story in its truth is uniform for me. You know, it's like I try to tell the story that's just the story that we're trying to tell, and I don't want to have to try to make something happen on screen that isn't already there. And because as soon as you try to do that, everything starts to feel forced. And I think that's the thing that is the through line for me between those three projects and anything else I do. It's like I try to just, you know, be honest with the story. One of the things that I learned very early on in acting class when I was 16 years old, and you know, I took acting classes when I was 16 because I had all my friends were taking acting classes.
Me too.
One of the acting teacher's name was Anthony Apes, and I'll never forget him. He apparently still teaches. You know, one of the things he taught was truth in storytelling. Very, very important, and I carry that with me now in terms of how I help tell the story, how I help tell a story with music. You know, it's all about trying to tell the truth. And that to me is the thing that sort of through lines for everything, for all those three projects and anything I'm trying to work on. It's like if I have a hard time telling the truth with the story, I know that there's a bigger problem that I need to address, you know?
Well, Jeff, thank you so much, and congratulations on all your work. I look forward to seeing more of Fargo season 3, and congratulations again.
Thank you very much, man.
You're welcome. Have a good one.
You too.
Thank you.